LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I picked out over 30 of the weekend's best clips for what should be an interesting show for you tonight, I think. As usual, my clips come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States. And I'll also have the usual political comedy clips this week just from Friday's Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. You can see the topics I'm covering listed down in the video description. If you're watching this as a recorded show, you should actually see time indexes down there to skip to whatever topics most interest you. The topics tonight include most clips of any topic is on the continuing conflict with ISIS in Syria and Iraq, especially after ISIS released this video this week of a caged Jordanian pilot being burned alive, which was really awful. But I'll also have a couple clips on the situation in Ukraine, with a growing split between the United States and Europe on whether to arm the Ukrainians against the Russian-backed separatists. I'll also have several clips again this week on the U.S. measles outbreak and the politics of the anti-vaxxers, and some clips at the end about the Republican candidates for president in 2016. But I want to start with this controversy our current president started at the National Prayer Breakfast, of all places, on Thursday, when he compared Islamic extremism today to past Christian extremism, which Bill Maher covered in his monologue on Friday, like this.
All right, well, the other big controversy that broke yesterday, President Obama was speaking at the prayer breakfast, which I never miss. I don't know what I hate more, prayer or breakfast. Anyway, and he was talking about Christianity, and he said, you know, let's not get on our high horse here as we judge the Middle East, because after all, Christians have a checkered past. The Crusades, the Inquisition, we killed a lot of people. Slavery was justified with Christianity. Republicans were outraged, and I could see their point. A religious event is no place for facts. But, you know...
Now, I actually watched the president's speech at the National Prayer Breakfast live on Thursday. I was switching through the channels and I noticed Fox News didn't even broadcast it in full. It just showed like a little clip with no audio at the beginning, although CNN and MSNBC both broadcast it. And it didn't really seem that controversial in context, as I'll show you with a couple-minute excerpt, though I put a link down to the full speech in the video description. But here's the supposedly controversial part, which actually started with a reference to ISIS as a death cult, as you can see over here.
See, ISIS, a brutal, vicious death cult that, in the name of religion, carries out unspeakable acts of barbarism, terrorizing religious minorities like the Yazidis, subjecting women to rape as a weapon of war, and claiming the mantle of religious authority for such actions. We see sectarian war in Syria, the murder of Muslims and Christians in Nigeria, religious war in the Central African Republic, a rising tide of anti-Semitism and hate crimes in Europe, so often perpetrated in the name of religion. And so how do we, as people of faith, reconcile these realities? The profound good, the strength, the tenacity, the compassion and love that can flow from all of our faiths, operating alongside those who seek to hijack religious for their own murderous ends. Humanity's been grappling with these questions throughout human history. And lest we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery And Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. Michelle and I returned from India, an incredible, beautiful country, full of this magnificent diversity, but a place where in past years religious faiths of all types have, on occasion, been targeted by other peoples of faith simply due to their heritage and their beliefs. Acts of intolerance that would have shocked Gandhiji, the person who helped to liberate that nation. So this is not unique to one group or one religion. There is a tendency in us, a sinful tendency that can pervert and distort our faith.
So that was a 2.5-minute excerpt of the supposedly controversial part of that speech, which didn't really seem that controversial to me, but they played it up on Fox News, and the Republicans were all aghast all week. And the one clip sort of representative of that I'm going to show is from Fox News Sunday, where they had on this retired general who was actually the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's sort of like the Pentagon's own version of the CIA, and they actually have a lot of parallel capabilities to the CIA. And so anyway, this is the general who ran the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was over on Fox News Sunday, and Chris Wallace played him up as being totally nonpartisan, and anything negative he might say about the strategy of the Obama administration must be really heartfelt and rational because he's such a nonpartisan guy. And that's kind of the way that Chris Wallace introduced this clip about the prayer breakfast to him, and got him to say that it was very unhelpful what President Obama said. Although, if you listen to the argument he makes about how we have to have like the moderate Sunnis fighting the extremist Sunnis, he's pretty much making the same argument that President Obama made, which is why it doesn't really make that much sense, but you can see it for yourself over here.
We are saying.
I know you don't want to be political about this, and you've made it clear, and I respect that, but there was a comment made this week by President Obama that I want to play. Here it is.
Unless we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ.
Honestly, General, at this particular moment at time when we are in a brutal fight, and we've seen just how brutal it can be with ISIS, how productive is it for the president to try to put what ISIS is doing in historical perspective with what the West did 1,000 years ago, and how productive to use the word crusades, which is an epithet which they throw at us for it to come out of the president's mouth?
Yeah. The risk that we take by comparing religions to religions, what we should be doing is we should be looking at one side being those contributing nations of the world, those that are willing to help the greater good of humanity against this radical form of Islam. And that's where I'm at. And that's where I think we need to be projecting ourselves forward and not looking. I mean, history is an indicator for a lot of things, and we should study it and we should know it. And we should recognize it for what it is. But right now, as I said earlier, the wolf closest to the sled is this radical form of Islam. The tactical issue is ISIS or ISIL in the greater Levant area, which is essentially Syria and Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, etc. But the wider problem is not just trans-regional in that part of the world, but it's also global. I mean, 40 to 50 countries supplying fighters to this current fight in the Middle East. Come on.
And when you were head a few months ago of the Defense Intelligence Agency, if you'd seen the president was going to start talking about the Crusades, what would you have said?
I would have recommended that he talk about something else.
Because?
Because I just don't think it's appropriate. I really don't think it's appropriate to begin to compare religions to religions. I mean, we are not about, religions fighting religions. What we're about is the greater good of the people of this world, of this planet, particularly this country, fighting against this evil that exists. And this evil that exists is inside of this religion. And so it's just like other ideologies that we face, Chris. We faced the Nazis. We faced the communists. We defeated those ideologies. this is another ideology that we are going to have to face. And those contributing nations of the world and those Arab nations, as I said, if they don't come to grips with this, they're going to feel the pain.
Well,
So, yeah, like I said, I don't really understand what that former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, what he was saying was all that different from what President Obama said in his National Prayer Breakfast speech. It just seemed like that Fox News had to find some way to sort of take it out of context and blow it out of proportion and not really look at what President Obama was really arguing, which is that there is, extremism in all religions, and it's kind of what I've said over many shows, the argument I've made over and over again, that if you look at the violence that results from Islamic extremism, if you're trying to figure out what is more to blame, the Islam or the extremism, it's the extremism, because there are so many Muslims who look at the same texts and listen to the same, religious listen to religious interpretations from their religious leaders and come up with a much more peaceful religion than these jihadis. And I know that's a controversial statement to make for some people who watch my broadcast, but I thought I would make it again. And I also am going to go mainly into the topic of ISIS. I think it's about 18 of my 32 clips, something like that, if I have my numbers right, are going to be on the fight against ISIS, which was a big topic on all the shows this morning. But I first want to show one more clip on ISIS from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. This is actually from the Overtime, which is available on HBO or on the Real Time YouTube channel. I put a link down to the Real Time YouTube channel in the video description, and they put up the entire 10+ minute Overtime from this week, and the Overtime segment where they take questions from the internet with the same guests are there for this whole season, and so and I don't know, the end of last season too, I think. Anyway, in this clip you'll hear this conservative from the Weekly Standard and this other guy who's written a book about some of the problems with Islam, but I think from a more liberal perspective. His name is Johann, I think, and they're talking. Bill Maher actually makes an interesting analogy that I haven't heard many places in the media between this Jordanian pilot being burned alive, and then they start talking about how U.S. policy has actually burned a lot of people alive, although not necessarily targeting them, and they make that comparison, which I think is a much more controversial comparison than the comparison between ISIS and the Crusades that got the right wing so upset. But anyway, here's that clip from the Overtime segment on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday over here.
I mean, it's obvious that America has also burned people alive from the air. I mean, in World War II, but, World War II wasn't...
Not just World War II, the drone attacks on Pakistan are incinerating children all the time, And that's the current President Obama.
It is a little different. It is a little different.
A guy in a cage,
collateral damage is a little...
burning him to death.
That's right. The collateral damage is a different...
That's the line that separates the barbarians.
Which, Jeremy Scahill, one of your former guests,
Right.
has documented. That's pretty atrocious, and that was done by
America
President
is
Obama.
certainly not guilt-free, but I don't think we're the moral equivalent of ISIS. No, I don't.
I don't think he's saying that.
There are crimes committed in peace, there are crimes committed in war, but we go to our utmost to try and minimize those casualties. There have been Americans...
Well, not always.
In Afghanistan, the rules of engagement were written in such a way that there are American men who are dead today because they followed attempts to protect civilian lives.
At the end of World War II, before we dropped the atom bomb, we wiped out from 50 to 90% of the population of Japan's biggest 60 cities. That's some serious shit.
Sure, but you don't need to go so far back, Bill. Sanctions against Iraq, even forget Bush's war, sanctions against Iraq, 500,000 children died as a result of those sanctions. If you blockade medicines from going into a country, huge numbers of people die. That's very recent. These people we're talking about, ISIS, who are disgusting and barbaric, they remember that. If you want to know why these people are attacking them, some of it is spontaneous religious bigotry, some of it is responding to atrocities we don't even remember.
Now that last point by that guy Johann about the sanctions against Iraq killing 500,000 children and how these are like atrocities committed by the United States that we don't even remember committing, that's something that doesn't get discussed in the media hardly at all. If you look at that book right over there behind my candle there. I've started reading this book by Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent. I'm not that far into the book, but when he talks about the propaganda model of the media, he says that the corporate media basically follows the elite opinion and the corporate opinion and the opinion of the power structure, and one of the ways they do that is they find worthy victims and unworthy victims, and they really, I've covered in my Liberal Viewer Sunday live clip roundup show the way that the American media often will talk about disasters and plane crashes, and they always want to tell you how many Americans were killed, because I guess Americans are the most worthy of all victims, but the manufacturing consent part of the book that I've read so far talks about how victims of states that are friendly with the United States are basically unworthy victims. They talk about the victims in Indonesia of Suharto, and but victims of our enemies are really played up as being, terrible, and it's awful. And I think Bill Maher wasn't buying into that equivalency between the United States and ISIS, incinerating people because some of it was collateral damage and some of it was, targeted. But actually, over in Bill Maher's monologue, he kind of pointed out some of this hypocrisy between the worthy and the unworthy victims. I think when he talked about how the burning of this Jordanian pilot, who I guess was a worthy victim, is when ISIS finally went too far. But then he compared it to some of the unworthy victims in the Muslim world, of course, in the Muslim world, because that's where Bill Maher likes to target his criticism, as we've seen so often in previous shows. But anyway, here's that joke from the monologue on Friday in this clip.
But they were pissed because, beheadings, sure, we can understand that. Mass executions, crucifixions, okay, burying children alive, who doesn't? Ethnic cleansing. But this is barbaric and medieval. The Saudis said if they got the guys who did this, they would chop their heads off right in the town square. So that they will not put up with barbaric and medieval.
And I guess there is some truth to that, even though it was so awful, this video of ISIS burning alive this Jordanian pilot, there's so many other victims of both sides in these conflicts, and I'll get to something about some of our allies, the Shiite militias in Iraq. That's going to come in a couple clips. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about the Jordanian reaction to the burning of the Jordanian pilot. First, here's a clip from Charlie D'Agata, a reporter for CBS over on Face the Nation this morning, talking about the Jordanian reaction and King Abdullah. When I see pictures of King Abdullah, for some reason I can never get out of my mind his the episode where he did a guest shot on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and now he's King of Jordan. That's a little odd, but anyway, here's Charlie D'Agata talking about how Jordan has reacted to this burning of the pilot who was downed in Iraq, and how it's really galvanized the nation to fight ISIS over in this clip.
Morning, Bob. Today, Jordanian officials say that their fighter jets have carried out dozens of airstrikes against suspected ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria over the past few days. This is the bombardment in retaliation for the gruesome execution of their pilot. King Abdullah had vowed there would be a relentless war against ISIS, and for most of the week, we've seen him in combat fatigues directing this new offensive. We also spoke to Jordan's foreign minister, who told us this is going to go way beyond airstrikes.
And we're not going to divulge our plans, but it's not just about increased air campaigns or sorties or combat sorties. It's with everything that we have. This is our fight. And if there was any shred of doubt that these people are evil, I think this horrific video was evidence enough.
And that message, this is our fight, is one that we've continued to hear throughout the week of taking ownership and taking the fight to ISIS, tapping into that anger and calls for revenge. Jordan's Queen Rania led a procession after Friday prayers where thousands of people came into the streets to demonstrate and also to hold a mass prayer in memory of their pilot. But the situation has raised security concerns here. This battle is being waged over the border in Iraq and Syria. We put that to the foreign minister, and he said we have to knock on their door before they knock on ours.
Now, what I thought was really remarkable, or what I thought I should most remark on from that report from CBS's Charlie D'Agata, was the part where they had on the Jordanian foreign minister, what's his name, Nasser, Judeh, and he said that this wasn't going to be just airstrikes from Jordan, even though they've stepped up their airstrikes, that there was going to be more, and that sounded almost like Jordan was going to send in ground troops. And there was a follow-up later on CBS's Face the Nation. Bob Schieffer had on Jordan's media minister. His name is, let me make sure I get his name right here, Mohammed al-Momani. And Bob Schieffer asked Mohammed al-Momani about the ground troop issue. And he seemed to say there might be the possibility of Jordanian ground troops. And then he said this thing about how this is actually the Third World War, which that's the only place I heard that this morning, and so I thought I would include that clip right here.
This has reacted strongly from the air. Do you think there's any possibility, or are you considering actually sending ground troops against ISIS?
At this point, coalition members are not speaking about boots on the ground. Having said that, this is a war, and His Majesty at some point described it as a Third World War. So if circumstances change, then we will discuss it at that point. But at this point of time, I think no one is talking about boots on the ground. The talk is about helping the Iraqi military, the Kurdish armed forces, and the Syrian forces, opposition moderate forces, to help fight terrorism.
Mr. Minister.
So what you saw there, the media minister from Jordan, Mohammed al-Momani, he said basically the same thing I heard from both Democrats and Republicans that I'll show later when they ask about ground troops, is that the ground troops are supposed to be the indigenous local forces, the Iraqi security forces in Iraq, and also the Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, and then these Syrian resistance fighters. And it turns out there's also Kurds in Syria, but the Syrian resistance fighters who were going to train up, and that's going to take like 3 years, if you remember a clip I showed a few weeks ago. But I want to show a clip from northern Iraq. This is also from CBS, their reporter Holly Williams, talking about those Iraqi forces that the Jordanian media minister was claiming was going to be the boots on the ground. How they're still pretty much in disarray. She went to northern Iraq to see if we're winning our fight against ISIS. And what's also interesting, this is the clip I was talking about earlier, where she reports on how the Iraqi forces that are fighting ISIS are actually the these Shiite militias who are also responsible for their own set of atrocities, and I'll talk about that a little more after you watch that report from CBS's Holly Williams in northern Iraq here.
From Dohuk in northern Iraq.
This is my 5th visit to Iraq since ISIS swept across the country last year, and I came here wanting to find out whether the extremists are any closer to defeat. The Iraqi National Army is still in disarray, as it has been since many of its soldiers downed their weapons and ran away from ISIS in June. So as Iraq tries to beat back ISIS, it's relying on Shiite Muslim militias like the Badr Brigades. We encountered them in Diyala province, where they just won a decisive victory over ISIS. The problem is that the Badr Brigades are implicated in the torture and murder of thousands of Sunni Muslims. And just a few days before our visit, they were accused of killing more than 70 unarmed Sunni men in that same area. So that effectively means that one of America's best allies in the fight against ISIS here in Iraq is a notoriously violent militia group. This week we also crossed into Syria, where they have a very different set of problems. Unlike in Iraq, ISIS has actually gained ground there during the airstrikes. And we travelled to a pocket of territory where Kurdish volunteers are holding out against the extremists. One of those young fighters is Deniz Sipan, a 22-year-old elementary school teacher who quit her job to become a sniper.
We want freedom, and we don't want to be afraid raising our kids in future and having a normal life, you know. If we didn't do it, I mean, the whole place will be full of ISIS.
The Kurdish fighters told us they've not seen a single airstrike and they desperately want some. But so far, the vast majority of strikes in Syria have targeted just one key city, Kobani. They sang battle songs to pass the time, but the mood was extremely tense. If ISIS launches a full-scale offensive on their positions, they have only light arms and they'd be quickly overrun. They urgently want international help, but in Syria they're unlikely to get it because the US is reluctant to get more deeply involved in the country's complex civil war, in particular if it could end up helping the Syrian regime.
So I thought that was a little strange that we're aiding the Kurds in northern Iraq, but we won't aid the Kurds in Syria. But there's all these different rules for Syria, I guess. And you saw Holly Williams on CBS there talking about how we spent all these airstrikes clearing ISIS out of Kobani. And I guess we're sort of concentrating on these population centers. And I'm going to show an interview with General John Allen in just a minute on that topic. But first I want to show another news report. This is from Phil Black over on CNN State of the Union, where he also talks about how the Iraqi security forces aren't ready to do these major combat operations in regard to another population center. This is the city of Mosul that ISIS is still holding on to, and he talks about how these airstrikes are now starting to concentrate on Mosul. There's been an uptick in airstrikes there, but it's going to be quite a while before they get to the next phase where there are ground troops from Iraq, the Iraqi security forces, that are ready to follow up on those airstrikes to actually retake the city of Mosul, and that's over in this clip.
Dana, everything we have seen and everything we've been told by frontline fighters on the ground here near Mosul suggests that there has been a significant uptick in airstrikes on ISIS positions in and around that ISIS-controlled city. We were at a distance of some 10 miles from the southern gates of Mosul. We saw multiple detonations. The sound of fast-moving aircraft overhead was pretty constant. This, as Kurdish fighters on the ground are really digging in and holding defensive lines a small distance away from that city. That's what they call phase one of this operation, to contain ISIS within that city. Phase two will be hard. It will be dislodging ISIS from that city. The Kurdish fighters say they'll be ready to take part. The time frame is not yet clear. Some US officials have suggested it could be as early as April. Kurdish officials think it's going to be longer than that, but ultimately it comes down to when the Iraqi army, controlled by the government in Baghdad, is ready to go. And that's no small task. Rebuilding, retraining, remotivating that army. It is the same force that ultimately abandoned Mosul when ISIS first invaded this region, Dana.
So yeah, there you can see it sounds like the airstrikes have sort of shifted from Kobani towards Mosul now that they've cleared out Kobani, and they use the Kurdish forces as the ground troops to clear out Kobani. But for Mosul, they're going to need these Iraqi security forces, and they're just basically not ready. And they might be ready. What did he say, in April or May or something, to follow up these airstrikes with to be the boots on the ground that actually retakes Mosul. But I guess we'll wait and see if that happens. But now I want to show this sort of extended clip from ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I've talked before about how Martha Raddatz has this really good access to military, to people in the Pentagon and military commanders, but she also kind of gives overly positive interviews to them that there's sort of this trade-off with, she's covered the Pentagon for so long that I guess she's has positive relations with a lot of the people that she interviews, which gives her the access and lets her ask important questions. And you'll see some of those important questions when she talks to General John Allen, although he's a retired general. But this is almost like, I think, over 3 minutes, this clip. It's about whether our strategy against ISIS is working. And see, General John Allen, he's a retired general, and then he was appointed as a special envoy from the Obama administration to our coalition fighting ISIS. So and there are a lot of questions that Martha Raddatz could have asked him. You'll see in part of this report, she gives him credit for helping with the Anbar awakening. But if you look down in the video description, I put a link to this article in Foreign Policy about how General John Allen is more of a political general, a parade ground general, they call him, and more of a rah-rah kind of guy who doesn't really get involved in the nitty-gritty. And he saying that he takes too much credit for the Anbar awakening in Iraq. He was just sort of there but didn't do that much. And I'm not saying that what they say in that Foreign Policy article is necessarily true, but none of those issues come up in this interview by Martha Raddatz, and this whole discussion where she first talks about how ISIS has done all this last week. There's this turning point because ISIS has now burnt alive this Jordanian pilot and created this galvanized response in the Arab world, and then she uses that as the lead into her interview with General John Allen, which I think is a little bit soft, but gets some good information, as I'll discuss after you watch it here.
The young pilot has backfired on the terrorist group. With shocking atrocities in the headlines this week, ISIS has redefined barbarity after the slaying of the Jordanian pilot. And now the group claims 26-year-old American aid worker Kayla Mueller, the last known American hostage, was killed in a retaliatory airstrike by the Jordanians.
Would you call this a tipping point?
It's a very important moment for our Arab allies within the coalition, and I think more broadly within the coalition, it'll be one of those moments that creates additional unity.
The man behind the unified fight against ISIS is retired Marine Corps General John Allen, appointed as President Obama's special envoy.
We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL.
The appalling events of this week underscore the urgency of the fight. On Tuesday, ISIS released video showing Jordanian pilot Muath al-Qasasbeh burned alive while trapped in a cage, triggering outrage around the world.
Do you believe the murder of Lieutenant Qasasbeh backfired on ISIL?
Absolutely it did.
Jordan's King Abdullah urging his people to fight back against ISIS. The first move, the execution of 2 al-Qaeda prisoners on Jordan's death row. Then, on Thursday, a wave of crushing Jordanian airstrikes, a video released to drive home the point. The missiles with inscriptions calling ISIS the enemy of Islam.
His Majesty the King, King Abdullah, has indicated a desire to do more.
What effect has this had on the rest of the coalition?
Well, I think it's galvanized the coalition, unified the coalition.
The importance of coalition is a lesson General Allen knows well. In Iraq, he helped unite Sunni tribes in the fight against al-Qaeda and forged relationships with Middle Eastern leaders involved in the fight against ISIS now.
The Arab states within this coalition are really providing important leadership in this regard.
Until now, Allen has faced difficulties in forming a true coalition. The U.S. has been responsible for more than 80% of all strikes against ISIS.
You told George Stephanopoulos last August that what was needed was a hard blow against ISIL, and that you needed a comprehensive plan. Have both those been accomplished?
I believe they have, actually. And Kobani is a good example of where that blow really fell heavily on ISIL.
Kobani, a former ISIS stronghold in Syria, now deserted after Kurdish forces pushed ISIS fighters out, as ABC's Alex Marquardt saw this week.
The businesses, piles of debris.
But much of the rest of the country is a battleground.
Syria seems like an absolute breeding ground for terrorism right now.
Well, it's a very important concern, obviously, to us. We don't have a partner in Syria as we do in Iraq.
When you look at Iraq, still about a third, that ISIL controls?
Well, they control population centers. That's what's relevant.
When you look at the Iraqi security forces, have they really come far enough to be capable of doing this in the next few months or even a year, to retaking territory?
We've worked very hard at several levels to prepare the Iraqi security forces to do this.
Coalition forces are going up against what General Allen believes is a more formidable enemy than even al-Qaeda.
ISIL is at an entirely different level than al-Qaeda was.
Are they harder to find now? They have adapted.
Well, they have, and we expected that would be the case. You don't see the long convoys now with flags flying in broad daylight. But we have also adapted our targeting process as well.
But still, the shadow of ISIS could be far-reaching.
Do you believe ISIS poses a threat to the homeland?
I think we should take it very seriously.
A stark reminder of that danger, aid worker Kayla Mueller's parents hold out hope she is still alive. And General Allen told me the U.S. is still looking into what happened, but meanwhile, the airstrikes continue unabated.
So you can see Martha Raddatz had good access there and got to ask some important questions and got answers from retired General John Allen, who's the Obama administration's envoy to the coalition fighting ISIS. But like I said, if you look down in the video description, you'll see I put a link to that foreign policy article that raises a lot of questions about General John Allen that, of course, Martha Raddatz never raised or never really had much of a critical tone in her way she addressed retired General John Allen, which I guess that's sort of the trade-off, access versus a little bit soft on the criticism. I don't know, you can let me know what you think down in the video description, but one thing that General John Allen said there was that ISIS has reached a new level beyond al-Qaeda, I guess because they're holding territory, and as I've discussed on this show over many months, one of the things that makes ISIS more successful than al-Qaeda in terms of holding territory is they took a lot of Saddam Hussein's former Ba'athist military officers into the organization, even though they're not really all that religious. They're, the Ba'ath Party was actually secular, but they've sort of teamed up with these Sunni radical Islamists, and because they're trained military officers, they know more than just terrorism. They know how to have strategic use of forces over different theaters, and they have a lot of strategic training, so that ISIS has been a lot more successful in a military sense beyond just being a terrorist organization. But that's not really how the Republican chair of the Homeland Security Committee, Mike McCall, took that statement from General John Allen when Bob Schieffer asked him about it. He saw it more as like a more generalized threat rather than the effect of having Ba'athist military officers in their leadership structure. But anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after you see how Mike McCall answers a question for Bob Schieffer about what General John Allen said this morning over here.
Well, John Allen, who is the head of the U.S. military effort against ISIS, told ABC this morning that ISIS is at and these are his words, an entirely different level than al-Qaeda. They're better organized, he said. They have better command. Do you agree with his assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, al-Qaeda denounced them because they're so brutal in their tactics, but they are a governing, functioning caliphate now. They own territory. They have a lot of money. And so they are far more dangerous, I think, than al-Qaeda has ever been. They're a lot more better organized. And if you look at their social media propaganda, like the film of the Jordanian pilot, is so sophisticated, and they send that out over the world to sort of inflame the potential radicalized Islam world that that, we're worried about not only the foreign fighters, but also the homegrown violent extremists that can look over the internet and get radicalized over the internet here in the United States.
So you saw how the Republican chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the House of Representatives, Mike McCall, there sort of transitioned from what General John Allen said about ISIS being more successful because they have this, and like I said, it's because of this better command structure from the Iraqi military. And then he transitioned that into their ability to radicalize us here in the homeland. And Bob Schieffer helped him out on that, definitely. I'm not sure where this question came from, but the other question I'm going to show Bob Schieffer asking Mike McCall on this issue is he actually asked him, do you think the Obama administration is taking this threat seriously enough? And, asking a Republican that question, it's kind of like I guess that's a pretty softball question, though. If you watch all the way to the end of the show, the last clip I'm going to show is definitely the worst softball question of the show. But this is a pretty bad softball from CBS Face the Nation host Bob Schieffer to Republican Mike McCall over in this clip.
Mr. Chairman, after seeing these reports, after hearing from a spokesman for the Jordanian government this morning, do you believe this administration, the Obama administration, is taking this threat seriously enough?
Not enough, and they never have. They won't even define the enemy for what it is, and that's radical Islamist extremism. I believe the airstrikes have been limited, had limited success. It's a policy of containment, not a policy to degrade and destroy the enemy. I think, if anything, the lighting on fire of this Jordanian pilot will now galvanize, I hope, the Arab nations to fight ISIS, including on the ground. We heard in your segment piece earlier that they say it's our fight. It's also the United States fight because we don't want them to attack us here on the homeland. So I think that under U.S. leadership, if we could galvanize these Arab nations, Sunni Arabs against Sunni extremists, ISIS in Syria, that would be the ideal. I think that there's no ground force in Syria. And as you heard in your reporting, the airstrikes are not sufficient to date to take care and take out ISIS right now.
So you heard the Republican chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the House of Representatives talk about how ISIS is actually a threat to the U.S. homeland. And just to respond to that a little bit, I want to show an answer from the Secretary of Homeland Security. That's, the Obama administration cabinet secretary, Jay Johnson, was over on CNN's State of the Union, and he answered a question about whether there's a threat to the U.S. homeland from ISIS. And I don't know. These little mistakes sometimes amuse me on the Sunday morning shows. This is Dana Bash from CNN State of the Union, who's filling in for Candy Crowley doesn't host anymore, and I don't know who the permanent host is going to be. And I don't think this is disqualifying, but she did refer to this FBI assistant director, I believe his name is Michael Steinbach. In her question to Jay Johnson, she referred to him actually as John Steinbeck. So this isn't really about the wrath of ISIS. I guess it's more kind of a grapes of wrath question. I don't know, over in this clip.
The jihadists overall. Americans looking at this, looking at the fighting, probably constantly saying, how does this affect me? How does this affect the United States? And say, why does it matter? John Steinbeck, who is the FBI's counterterrorism division head, told CNN's Pam Brown about an example of why it should matter. Listen to this.
There are individuals that have been in communication with groups like ISIL who have a desire to conduct an attack, yes.
That are living in the U.S. right now.
Correct.
People who are in contact with ISIL living in the U.S. right now. How many are we talking about?
Well, Dana, I would put it this way. We've evolved to a new phase in the global terrorist threat, in that 13 years ago when we were attacked on 9/11, we had a relatively conventional command and control structure from core al-Qaeda that would deploy operatives to commit terrorist acts. The situation now is more decentralized, more diffuse, and frankly, more complex in that terrorist organizations such as ISIL or al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula use the internet use social media to communicate and to inspire acts of terrorism in individuals' home countries. And for that reason, we need to be particularly vigilant here at home, working with state and local law enforcement, working with the public through campaigns such as If You See Something, Say Something. It is a more complex situation, very clearly.
Certainly.
So yeah, there was nothing really controversial about that answer. You know, Jay Johnson, I've seen a lot of his answers. They seem to be a lot of talking points a lot of the time without really having a lot of substantive answers to the questions. I've noticed a lot of the time. But that question, I don't know. Maybe it's just I'm the only one who's amused by the whole John Steinbeck thing. And you know, like I said, you can't really fault someone for a slip of the tongue like that. As having done this live broadcast, this is the 94th edition of Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. I'm sure I've mispronounced and even misstated almost one name per show. It must be at least. But anyway, I want to move from the topic there of the threat to the homeland over to another of the important topics in the ISIS conflict, whether the United States should provide any boots on the ground, or another way to put it is U.S. combat troops, because there are like a few thousand boots on the ground already in Iraq, although not really in Syria, at least not that we admit, although I guess there are probably some special forces or whatever in Syria that we're not talking about. But one of the interesting things about the people who are on the Sunday morning shows is it was pretty much almost bipartisan agreement not to put U.S. boots on the ground, but that the Kurds are supposed to be our boots on the ground, and eventually the Iraqis. It's kind of like what that Jordanian media minister was saying earlier, that the Syrian resistance forces will be the boots on the ground in Syria, and the Kurds and the Iraqi security forces will be the boots on the ground in Iraq. But here's Senator Ted Cruz basically making that argument, especially saying really strong things about the Kurds and how we're not arming them directly, we're arming them through Iraq. And this is over on, he was on a couple shows this morning. This is from his interview on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where George Stephanopoulos reminded him about how he said that we should bomb ISIS back to the Stone Age, and then asked him, you know, what besides the bombing, what about the boots on the ground? And here's his answer in this clip.
Against ISIS this weekend in Munich, and I know you've said in the past that the answer is to bomb ISIS back to the Stone Age. Most experts say that will not be enough, that you will need ground forces as well. Would you call up American forces if others don't step up?
You know, I don't believe right now we need American boots on the ground, and the reason is we have boots on the ground already with the Kurds. The Peshmerga are trained, effective fighters. They are close allies of us. Just today, I met with the president of Kurdistan, and he made clear that the Peshmerga are ready to fight. They are fighting ISIS. But I'll tell you, George, it makes no sense. Our government is not providing military weapons effectively to the Kurds. Instead, they're shuttling it all to Baghdad, and Baghdad is very slow in getting it to the Kurds. We need to arm the Kurds, and we need to use the Peshmerga as boots on the ground. They're effective, they're ready, they're our close allies.
But if that's not enough, would you be willing to send American ground troops into that battle?
Look, we need to accomplish the mission, and the mission should be defeating ISIS before they succeed in carrying out more horrific acts of terror, before they succeed in murdering Americans. If need be, we should go that step, but it should be driven by the mission. And the first step should be to effectively arm the Peshmerga, use them as boots on the ground, and to use serious, overwhelming air power. The problem is, right now, the Obama-Clinton-Kerry foreign policy has been consistently wrong. It's been wrong on ISIS, it's been wrong on Russia, it's been wrong on Iran. And when it comes to ISIS, our policy of leading from behind, we've seen essentially photo op foreign policy, where we drop a bomb here or a missile there. We need a focused, direct military objective of taking out and destroying ISIS.
ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
So yeah, Senator Ted Cruz, as usual, is very good at talking in the sound bites. I like the photo op comment, and then also what was it, the Obama, Clinton, Kerry foreign policy, so that he's all ready to take on Hillary Clinton, and from several things he said, and I'm going to show a clip a little later when I talk more about the Republican presidential candidates from Ted Cruz, where he sounds very much like he's going to run for president, and that answer that he gave on CNN State of the Union, or I'm sorry, on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, is very similar to an answer he gave over on CNN State of the Union, which I'm not going to show because it's duplicative, but over on CNN State of the Union, they also had a Democratic point of view from Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, who actually pretty much agreed with Ted Cruz on the idea of no boots on the ground. That's kind of bipartisan. Not completely, but, because I've shown clips from like Lindsey Graham saying we need 10,000 troops on the ground. But here's Senator Tim Kaine over on CNN State of the Union pretty much agreeing with Ted Cruz, even explicitly agreeing with Ted Cruz on the idea of the local forces being the boots on the ground in this clip.
Armed Services Committee. And Senator, I want to start with what appears to be the question of the day, ground troops. Do you believe that there should be ground troops in Iraq to go after ISIS, as many as 10,000 as some are calling for?
Dan, I actually believe there should be ground troops, but they should be ground troops from the region and not U.S. ground troops. I heard the interview with Senator Cruz, the Peshmerga, that is the fighting wing of the Kurds, the Iraqi security forces, other regional actors. I think we just got to be candid. We cannot police a region that won't police itself. And so the ground troops need to be from the region, but the United States' strong support via the air campaign, via training and equipping, helping guide the air campaign to make that effective. That's what we should do. That's what we are doing, and we can do more of it.
Well, first, let's just say that you just agreed with Senator Cruz. I'm not sure that you expected to do that on many issues.
No, on this one, we're in the same place because, again, we can't police a region that won't police itself. I was with King Abdullah earlier this week, very emotional after the death of this Jordanian pilot in a horrible way. But even he said, this fight against ISIL, it is our fight. It is the region's fight. The U.S. can help us, but you can't do it for us. We've got to speak out against the regional terrorism, and it's up to us to do it.
Do you agree?
So when Democratic Senator Tim Kaine is actually agreeing with one of the more wacky Republican senators, Ted Cruz, maybe there's something to the idea of the local forces serving as the boots on the ground. There are some difficulties with it. I showed in that earlier clip from the CNN reporter, I think it was, who showed how a lot of the current Iraqi security forces that are effective are these Shiite militias that also have a lot of problems with human rights abuses and committing their own, not to the extent as ISIS, but doing their own sort of atrocities, and that's not really helpful to the cause and doesn't help unite Iraq in such a way that the moderate democratic forces are opposing extremists like in ISIS. But as long as I have showing a clip from Senator Tim Kaine, I also want to show another answer he gave to Dana Bash over on CNN State of the Union. This is on how Congress is pretty much reneged on its responsibility to declare war and set limits on where the United States and the executive branch puts its forces. And he actually admits that both Democrats and Republicans told the president before the November election, we don't want you to bring this issue up, so don't ask us for any authorization for use of military force. But apparently that's actually going to happen in the next week or two, as he tells Dana Bash on CNN State of the Union here.
About what to do now with regard to ISIS. You are somebody who actually has been there. Senator, you mentioned it's been 6 months, which is kind of hard to believe, since the airstrikes have started. It's been happening without a new authorization from Congress, which you have been calling for since day one. We now think that it's actually going to, at least the wheels are going to start moving this coming week.
Yes.
What took so long?
Well, Dana, it is not a pretty sight, and I'm really sort of very discouraged, but frankly, both by the administration and by Congress. When the president started this war on the 8th of August, I indicated right from the start that there were not existing legal authorities from 2001 and 2002 that would justify this action. And as soon as we decided to engage in a war on ISIL, and that's what the administration has called it,
Senator,
Congress needed to weigh in.
And what is the administration saying to you, a fellow Democrat who's been very outspoken about why they've dragged their feet so long?
Well, partly because the congressional leadership went to the administration in July, both houses and both parties. And I'm sad to say this, Dana, but the leadership went to the White House and said, do what you need to do. We would rather not take this up before a midterm election. So I introduced a resolution in September authorizing limited military action against ISIL, but Congress wouldn't vote on it before the midterm. And then I pushed it after November, and I was able to get a vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee defining this mission in a limited way. We voted out a bill of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in December, but the House hasn't even been willing to talk about this in a committee. And I'll tell you what offends me about this. We've already lost American service members' lives in this operation, and we've done it without Congress being willing to do the job of having a vote. If we're going to ask people to risk their lives, then Congress ought to do our job and put our thumbprint on this mission and say it is in the national interest. I think the White House will send an authorization up. There's going to be some hard questions about it, but I think the President will find strong support in both houses for taking appropriate military action.
Senator, let's just...
I think Senator Tim Kaine is right in saying that Congress has shirked its responsibility and should have actually held hearings and votes and either stop President Obama from doing as much as he's doing or put limits on it, and decided, you know, what circumstances there would be these so-called boots on the ground. And even boots on the ground is not a very descriptive term, since we have like 3,000 troops there, but just not combat troops. And anyway, I thought that was an important clip to show on what's happening with the authorization for use of military force. Now I want to show several clips on, this is sort of on the idea of what I guess Susan Rice said in a speech this week, and the Obama administration came out with this idea of their national security strategy being strategic patience, is what they're calling it. And before I get to several clips from Senator John McCain, did an interview on NBC's Meet the Press. First, I want to show one clip. This is also from CNN State of the Union. This is actually one of the most hawkish of all the people I saw on the morning shows. This is a Democrat. I think she's from Hawaii. Her name is Tulsi Gabbard. I actually played this clip by mistake for a couple seconds at the beginning of the previous clip. I just want to show that not all the hawkish people are Republicans. This Democratic member of Congress is actually an Iraq war veteran. Maybe that's why she seems kind of hawkish. You know, I showed there was agreement from Tim Kaine and Senator Tim Kaine and Senator Ted Cruz, very different sides of the spectrum, both against ground troops. And here you'll see Representative Tulsi Gabbard agrees with them, but then seems to be agreeing for the need of ground troops without saying that they have to be local people and not U.S. ground troops. And then she goes into this whole thing about radical Islam, which sounds more Republican than Democrat, I thought. And I'll talk about that a little more after you see that clip over here.
About what to do now with regard to ISIS. You are somebody who actually has been there. You were in combat in Iraq. Do you think it is the right thing to be sending in as many as 10,000 ground troops, as some are calling for, in order to just try to completely annihilate ISIS once and for all?
Well, first of all, on the question of ground troops, I agree with the two people, Senator Kaine as well as Senator Cruz, who just spoke earlier, that yes, there do need to be ground troops on the ground to work in conjunction with the airstrikes that we and Jordan and some of the other coalition forces are conducting in order to be effective. But I think we also need to take it one step previously. We need to start with the basics, which is, first of all, identifying who our enemy is, understanding that this war cannot be won, this enemy and threat cannot be defeated unless we understand what's driving them, what is their ideology. And the fact is, when you look at what is happening today, we have over 40 different Islamic extremist terrorist groups going by different names. You look at the vast majority of terrorist attacks that have been committed around the world, there's one common element here, and it is this radical Islamic ideology. And in order to defeat it, we have to do so militarily, but also simultaneously, it has to be an ideological defeat as well as a political solution that's offered.
And on that note...
So yeah, that was that Democratic representative Tulsi Gabbard, and she said things that I've heard Republicans say that seemed a little bit too gung-ho to me. The thing about most terrorist attacks being Muslim, I think I even made a video about that. I didn't put it down in the video description, but maybe if you're watching this as a recorded show, I'll remember to put that down there about whether are most terrorists Muslim? No, most terrorists are not Muslim. If you go worldwide, a lot of terrorist acts have to do with these separatist movements that are not Muslim, and there are all sorts of other political and economic and all sorts of conflicts that cause terrorism that have nothing to do with Islam, and most terrorists are not Muslim. But that clip was the last clip I want to show before getting to this idea of strategic patience that I sort of prematurely got to before that clip. And before I get to the clips of the Senator John McCain interview that talk about that a little more, first I want to show a quick clip from the Jordanian foreign minister where George Stephanopoulos asked him on ABC this morning if ISIS was on the run with all these new Jordanian airstrikes, and he answered yes, of course, but then he also said that it's not going to be quick or easy, which, like I said, plays into this whole strategic patience idea. But first, here it is from the Jordanian foreign minister on ABC this morning here.
I say that the atrocity against your pilot by ISIS this week has really galvanized the Arab world, galvanized the coalition in the fight against ISIS. We've seen Jordan step up the fight. Do you believe right now that ISIS is on the run?
They are on the run. They're not gone yet, but certainly, I mean, the sustained air campaign of the last few months has degraded their capabilities on the ground. We know that. They still control vast territory. They still have access to serious cash and funds, and they have access to sophisticated weaponry. So they're not gone as a threat yet. There's no doubt we shall prevail, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick.
Mr.
So not going to be easy, not going to be quick, and that's kind of like strategic patience, although I haven't quite gotten to the strategic patience clip. First I want to show John Kerry's answer to NBC's Chuck Todd on that same basic question, are we winning against ISIS? And he gives all these metrics. It's kind of interesting. It almost reminds me of the way the generals used to talk about the Vietnam War, where John Kerry's a Vietnam War veteran and then a Vietnam War protester, so you would think he would be more sensitive to these like weird metrics that show we're winning that don't really tell us whether we're winning or not, that he gives to Chuck Todd to tell us that we're winning in the fight against ISIS over in this clip.
Are we actually winning in our goal of diminishing and eventually destroying ISIS?
Well, I believe we are on the road to. Yes, I absolutely do. And I think the evidence is not in my saying it, but it's in the facts of what is happening. First of all, the coalition is strong, more committed than ever, particularly in the aftermath of the burning of the Jordanian pilot. The resounding reaffirmations of commitment throughout the Arab world have been heartening and strong. We have already seen, I mean, here's what's happened. 22% of the populated areas that they held have been taken back already. And that's without launching what we would call a major offensive. It's with the efforts of the Iraqi army as it's being retrained and standing up again to reclaim some territory as they begin to probe. We have taken out a significant proportion of the top leadership of ISIS. Their command and control facilities have been attacked, interrupting their command and control. They no longer can communicate the way they were as openly. They no longer travel in convoys the way they were as openly, or where they do, they're at great risk. Now, there's a lot more to do. We have said since the beginning this is a long-term operation, not a short-term one. But we believe everything, including the governing process in Iraq itself, is moving in the right direction.
Well, I want
to... So, yeah, I thought that was a worthwhile answer to show. I'm sorry, I'm getting like some problems message from YouTube saying that there may be problems with my stream rate. Some of you may be getting buffering. I don't know if you're... Let me know if you're experiencing any problems. I'm reading your comments along the way. I mean, it seems like it's broadcasting okay, but I want to show the next answer from Secretary of State John Kerry talking to Chuck Todd, where he confronts him with the leader of the Kurdish area, saying that he doesn't really see a U.S. strategy yet at this point. One of the things I thought was kind of amusing about this is if you watch how Chuck Todd asked the question, it's pretty clear that he can't remember the name of the chancellor, or I think he may actually be the president of the Kurdish area of Iraq. His name is Barzani, and you'll see at the beginning of the question, Chuck Todd can't remember his name, and then he shows a clip of Richard Engel interviewing him, and then by the time the Richard Engel clip is done, he knows his name and asked Secretary Kerry to explain why the head of the Kurds, who's our strongest ally as boots on the ground, thinks we don't have a strategy yet, and gets more of this answer that it's just not going to be quick, because that's one of the things that the head of the Kurds says over in this clip.
I was just going to say, not everybody agrees that the U.S. is doing enough. My colleague Richard Engel had an interview with the head of the Kurdish province in Iraq. I want you to take a listen to what he said about the war.
President Obama said there's a strategy in place to degrade and defeat ISIS. Do you believe him?
Well, he's the president of the United States.
But do you believe there is a strategy in place that will do that?
I hope there is, but we need that strategy to be translated into action.
So you're not seeing it?
Not yet.
You're not seeing the strategy? We have not seen... That can degrade and defeat?
Not yet. I mean, so far we have not seen any serious action that can quickly defeat ISIS.
Or slowly? Can it work over the long term?
It can, but once again, I mean, we are sacrificing more lives and putting many innocent lives at risk by allowing ISIS to survive for a longer period.
Now, Secretary, that was Chancellor Barzani. That's what he was telling Richard Engel. He's essentially saying they need more support, they need swifter action from the United States. What do you say in response?
Well, you heard the key word there, which was not quickly, but he said over time it can work. And we have said consistently that this is going to take a certain amount of time. Now, why? Is that because we want it to take amount of time? No. The fact is that the Iraqi army itself needs to be retrained and stood up. There have to be ground troops involved in order to win this victory. And it's clear they're not going to be American, they're not going to be British, they're not going to be French and European. They are going to be Iraqi, and that's the way the Iraqis want it. But they're not ready to move yet, and it would be a great mistake strategically for them to move before they are ready. So if, I understand President Barzani's impatience. I fully understand it. The Peshmerga have been particularly brave and courageous. We have supplied them with enormous amount of ammunition, weapons, other things, and others are supplying them, our allies. So I think, as we've said from the beginning, people need to be recognizing the importance of putting in place a strategy that can win.
Now, your plea...
So, yeah, there's Secretary John Kerry saying that despite what the head of the Kurdish region in Iraq says, we do have a strategy. It's just not a quick strategy. It's going to take some time. And, you know, training up those Syrian resistance fighters supposedly is going to take like 3 years, and that goes beyond the Obama administration. That's one of the reasons it's important for Congress to get involved. But I want to show you one more clip from Secretary John Kerry on the topic of ISIS, and then I'll show another clip from him on the Ukraine topic. But this is the last clip on the topic of ISIS, and by the way, now YouTube says my stream health is good. It was only from like 7:38 p.m. to 7:40 p.m. that there was a problem with my stream. Now my stream is strong again, so yippee. But here's the last clip on ISIS from Secretary of State John Kerry. This is specifically on the issue of strategic patience and how that's, you know, it's like a more detailed version of the Obama administration policy of don't do stupid stuff, basically, I guess. And I guess Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, as part of his right-wing foreign policy running for president attempt, tweeted about strategic patience and kind of made fun of it. And Chuck Todd asked Secretary of State John Kerry about that, and he responds in this clip.
A former colleague of yours in the U.S. Senate, Lindsey Graham, was sort of mocking, and it had to do more with a speech that Susan Rice gave on Friday, outlining the new national security strategy. And he tweeted this. He said, "I doubt ISIL, the Iranian mullahs, or Vladimir Putin will be intimidated by President Obama's strategy of strategic patience." And the other implication here, Mr. Secretary, is that patience, waiting too long, is what allowed an ISIS to gain a foothold, that we didn't react soon enough, and now we're paying the price for it.
Well, ISIS gained the foothold that it gained in Iraq principally because the army had been personalized and fundamentally become a sectarian entity. And so within Sunni areas, unfortunately, there weren't enough people with a stake in the game in order to stand their ground because that wasn't their army. And so there are a lot of reasons for how we got to where we are today. What we need to understand is that we have moved from instant one to buttress Iraq, to build a coalition. People were astonished that we were able to get 5 Sunni nations to join us in taking on the challenge of Syria.
Okay.
I think we have put together a strong coalition. I just don't buy into that.
So I actually think there is something to this idea of strategic patience and not reacting to the, instantaneous news cycle and being, seeing threats as too large. One of the things about the strategic patience idea, that one of the things Susan Rice said in her speech was that as bad as some of these Islamic extremist threats like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and some of the stuff going on in Northern Africa, and all those things are threats, but none of them are existential threats like World War II or even the Cold War with mutual assured destruction. I thought it was kind of a more thoughtful approach than you get. At least the Democratic foreign policy just seems more thoughtful to me than the Republican hawkish foreign policy, even though I worry that it's a little bit too far to the right. And one of the ways that Democratic and Republican foreign policy is coming together, moving on to my next topic, this is on the topic of the ongoing conflict in the Ukraine, where Russian separatists have been armed and supported by Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to show a couple quick clips on this. There was this conference in Europe that Ted Cruz was at, and I'm going to show a clip from Ted Cruz on this topic in just a minute. But now Angela Merkel, the head of Germany, is coming over to the United States in the next couple days, and they're going to try to resolve this split where the United States seems more and more willing to arm the Ukrainian government to fight the Ukrainian or the pro-Russian separatists. And first, here's Secretary of State John Kerry talking more in holistic terms about U.S.-Russian relations, answering a question from Chuck Todd about whether Vladimir Putin is actually a rational actor, and he doesn't really answer that question, but seems to think that the harms to Russia from what Vladimir Putin is doing is going to make Russia act rationally, even if Vladimir Putin isn't rational. Over in this clip.
Is he a rational?
With that promise.
Do you believe President Putin is a rational actor here? Because you outlined the economic sanctions and the drop in oil have had a huge impact, and yet it has not changed his behavior.
Well, I'm not going to get into characterizations, except people can draw their own conclusions based on what they see. He is leaving the global community with no choice but to continue to either put more sanctions in place or to provide additional assistance to Ukraine. And hopefully he will come to a point where he realizes the damage he is doing is not just to the global order and the process, but he is doing enormous damage to Russia itself. And I'm convinced, I think most people are convinced, that each month that goes by, that will catch up to him ultimately in Russia itself. The nationalistic card is playing for the moment, but ultimately people want their lives to be better.
Quickly, last.
Now, I was hoping that when Chuck Todd asked Secretary of State John Kerry about whether Vladimir Putin was rational, that he might talk about this weird story I saw that some State Department or someone in the Obama administration had decided that Vladimir Putin was on the autism spectrum or had Asperger's syndrome, and I think they talked about that with a different guest on one of the other shows, a clip I'm not going to show, but I do want to show one more clip on the Ukraine. This is Senator Ted Cruz over on CNN State of the Union. He just came back from this conference, and he's still in Munich about to fly home, and Dana Bash asked him about this split between the U.S. and Angela Merkel, and he somehow turned it all around to blame it on the Obama administration, which I'll talk about a little more after you see that clip over here.
Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the fight over what to do about the Ukraine. The German Chancellor, the French President have been trying to negotiate some kind of an agreement, and Angela Merkel of Germany has specifically said she does not think it is time to arm the Ukrainians yet. Why do you think she's wrong?
Well, what she said at this conference is that she did not believe there was any prospect for Ukraine to be successful in defending itself against Russian aggression. I think that's mistaken, but at the same time, I think Chancellor Merkel's position is not surprising given where President Obama's position is. What we're doing with regard to Ukraine and with regard to Russia makes no sense, and it isn't working. It is long past time for us to step forward and provide defensive weapons so that the men and women of Ukraine can defend their nation. They are our allies. In the Budapest Memorandum, we committed ourselves to standing with Ukraine to defend them, to defend their territorial integrity.
You mentioned the fact that you think that the German Chancellor is wrong. There seems to be a pretty significant rift here between within the Western powers on how to deal with this. Do you think that the U.S. should just arm the Ukraine over the objections of the Germans?
Well, look, there isn't a rift. I mean, what we're seeing is when America doesn't lead, Europe can't be expected to step into the breach. What is missing from this is the President of the United States. And I got to tell you, Dan, I'm part of a large bipartisan congressional delegation here, and it is striking that across bipartisan lines, the delegation is united on the need for us to get serious and provide defensive arms to Ukraine.
So, like I said, somehow he turned it all around to be a problem of the Obama administration where, I mean, whether you are in favor or opposed to sending arms to the Ukrainian government to fight these Russian separatists, and there's a good argument that it's a bad idea because they're not going to win that conflict militarily, and putting more weapons in there just means there's going to be more fighting rather than more diplomacy, which is what is going to be the actual solution. But then there, I guess, some people who think that it's appeasement against Putin, and I find that kind of ironic that it's actually Germany that's leading the appeasement movement this time around, where Germany is the big appeaser against the Vladimir Putin tyrant. But anyway, that's obviously going to be an ongoing topic. It's been a topic on the show on and off for almost a year now. I don't know, 9 months, something like that, since when the whole Crimea thing, when Russia took over Crimea. But it's not going away anytime soon, I guess. But a topic I hope goes away, but it looks like it's still growing, is this epidemic of not an epidemic, but an outbreak of the measles in the United States. So there's been pockets of anti-vaccination people in the United States. And first I want to show a clip from, this is it, let me make sure I have the right one here. Yeah, this is NBC's Meet the Press again. Chuck Todd had a little report on the anti-vaxxers where he had this woman on named Megan Heims talking about why she's an anti-vaxxer and sort of covering the whole anti-vax movement a little bit. And then I'll show some Bill Maher clips talking where he tries to pretend he's not an anti-vaxxer. But first, here's the NBC coverage of the anti-vax movement and how it's creating these pockets of where don't have enough people vaccinated over in this clip.
So to me, it's really a slam dunk.
But a small yet significant percentage of parents aren't listening. In 17 states, preschool vaccination rates are below 90%, the baseline goal set by federal health officials. Last year, 644 measles cases were reported in 27 states, a 20-year high, and this year's off to a bad start.
In some ways, I think you can say that vaccines have been a victim of their own success. If you have a child today, you're not likely to have lived during a time when thousands of Americans were infected every year and hospitalized every year.
The anti-vaccine movement gained steam in 1998, when a now discredited study linked the measles shot to autism. That medical journal later retracted it, calling it utterly false.
I believe many parents do not trust the CDC or the government or think that they're putting our best intentions first.
Megan Heimer is a mother of 2 toddlers and an anti-vaccine advocate. She and her husband have chosen not to vaccinate their children, even though he performs vaccinations at the clinic where he works as a family doctor.
Mandating vaccinations opens up the door for them to mandate all sorts of other things: what my child eats, where my child goes to school, how often my child sees a doctor.
The vast majority of parents, Republican and Democrat, vaccinate their children.
But the fact that the science is clear hasn't stopped politicians from pandering to this small minority.
We vaccinate ours, but I also understand that parents need to have some measure of choice in things as well.
I've heard of many tragic cases of walking, talking, normal children who wound up with profound mental disorders after vaccines. I'm not arguing vaccines are a bad idea. I think they're a good thing, but I think the parents should have some input.
After criticism, both Christie and Paul jumped to clarify their comments. Paul posted this picture of himself getting a booster shot. Christie's office put out a statement saying, quote, "There is no question kids should be vaccinated." And of course...
So if getting vaccinated causes mental problems or is associated with mental problems, like Senator Rand Paul, who's a doctor, said there, does that kind of explain why he said that since he's getting vaccinated? I don't know. What Governor Christie said, I don't think is actually that bad, that there's some sort of balance in his original comment, and parents, they have to have some level of choice maybe. In terms of mandatory vaccinations, I don't think it's that much of a problem when it's as a condition to go to public school. As to whether the government can actually force people to get vaccinated in general when it's not related to school, I think that is a balancing test, that there has to be a compelling interest and it has to be narrowly tailored to meet that compelling interest. So it has to be something that creates a real risk to the population, and where public education and voluntary vaccinations isn't going to be enough to get the vaccination rate up high enough to stop the public health threat. So, there is a privacy interest that people have in getting to decide for themselves whether to have things injected into their bodies. But that doesn't mean that vaccinations aren't a good idea, and when people are making those decisions, they're stupid if they don't decide to vaccinate and don't decide to vaccinate their kids. And speaking of people who are against vaccination, I showed that clip of that woman Megan Heims, who said, what I thought was kind of weird about that clip was they said her husband was a doctor. But why didn't they show him in the clip then? Why was it only the woman who talked about whether they have our best intentions at heart, instead of our best interests? That, well, I guess people make mistakes when they're talking on camera all the time, like I said. So can't hold that against her too much. Although I looked up her husband, and her husband is a doctor, but he's a doctor of osteopathy, which, that's still a doctor, but they go to a different medical school that, from what I understand, that they aren't quite as competitive as the medical schools that MDs go to, and There are a lot of good doctors who are doctors of osteopathy, but if you look at the entire pool of doctors of osteopathy versus medical doctors, MDs, that the quality of training and of the pool of applicants might be a little higher for the MDs possibly. But I also want to show Bill Maher dealing with this whole idea of measles and vaccinations. And first he tries to sort of weasel out of his own anti-vaccination positions in the past in the intro to that topic on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday over in this clip.
A topic that's getting everybody crazy in America, measles, and what goes on here. And, when I start these conversations, I always have to say, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, never have been. I'm an anti-flu shot guy, because I think that's bullshit. And I think the fact that it was 23% effective this week bears that out. Okay, but, if Ebola was airborne, I'd get the vaccine tomorrow. But let me just start before we get into the thing itself. The attitude of the media this week kind of pissed me off. It was just a lot of shut the fuck up. It reminded me of the Iraq War, the first weeks. Just don't ask any questions.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that bothered anybody else. And then I was wondering what you think we should do about this problem of parents who may not want to do it versus the public good.
Now that last part about, the parents' rights versus the public good, that, like I said, I think that is a real balancing test, that there is, if you want to send your kids to public school, you should probably get them, or I don't have a problem with mandating vaccinations for that. And this idea of having religious exemptions but not other personal belief exemptions, that doesn't seem fair, that only people who are rational for religious reasons get an exemption. Why can't people who are rational for non-religious reasons get an exemption? And then why should any of them get an exemption, at least for going to public school? But I thought it was kind of strange that Bill Maher didn't really own up to his own anti-vaxxer ideas in the past, and he seemed to say that the fact that the flu vaccine isn't as effective some years as others also makes his views from the past legitimate. And you can see also that he seems to think that medical science is some sort of different science than climate science, where, I don't know, it seems like a lot of weather predictions don't come true, but you wouldn't know it from what Bill Maher said on that topic a couple minutes later in his show over here.
Can I make one more point about the media that bothered me this week? The analogy that I see all the time is that if you ask any questions, you are the same thing as a global warming denier. I think this is a very bad analogy, because I don't think all science is alike. I think climate science is rather straightforward, because you're dealing with the Earth. It's a rock. I'm not saying I know how to deal with it, but climate scientists from the very beginning have pretty much said the same thing. And their predictions have pretty much come true. It's atmospherics and it's geology and chemistry, and that's not true of the medical industry. I mean, they've had to retract a million things because the human body is infinitely more mysterious. People get cancer and doctors just don't know why. They just don't know why, and they don't know how to fix it. And they put mercury in my teeth. I remember my father had ulcers, and they treated it wrong when I was a kid. Thalidomide. I mean, I could go on with all the times they have been wrong. So to compare those two sciences, I just think is wrong. Okay, let me ask you. Yeah, it's true. That doesn't mean.
I don't know why Bill Maher got applause for that, and after he compared the media not asking enough questions about vaccines to the media not asking enough questions about the Iraq War, to say that the analogy to climate science is invalid, it seems the other one was a lot bigger of a stretch. I mean, they're both sciences. That means that sometimes that things that seem to be true are replaced by better data, and there are advances, and there have been advances in climate science and advances in medical science. And having grown up in a medical family, being the child of a doctor and the brother of a doctor and the husband of a doctor, that I think I've actually gotten quite a healthy skepticism for how much doctors really know. And there are a lot of things doctors don't know, but there are a lot of things scientists don't know. I mean, science is not about knowing everything. It's about a way of looking at things where you use evidence to make your decisions, and the best evidence and the best data. But when you get new data, then that can change your conclusions, and that doesn't mean that science is invalid, whether it's biological science of the human body or climate science and meteorology, and I don't know where Bill Maher got that whole analysis, but one place where there's a more rational analysis, although a little bit blaming on the media, I guess, in a way, is from someone who often says things that aren't very rational, a Republican who sounds also like he's running for president, even though he's never held a political office, Dr. Ben Carson, who Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday pointed out was a renowned neurosurgeon several times in the broadcast. And at the end of the program, I'm going to show what I think is one of the worst softball questions in the Republican primaries I've seen so far, and there haven't been any primaries, but I mean in terms of the 2016 Republican presidential candidates. But first, here's what Ben Carson says when Chris Wallace tries to get him to say that Senator Rand Paul was being unreasonable, as another doctor saying that thing about there being association between mental problems and vaccinations. But Ben Carson doesn't take the bait over in this clip.
You have been hardline on vaccinations. When it comes to serious diseases like measles, you say that parental authority is trumped by public health. Here's what Rand Paul had to say about that this week.
I've heard of many tragic cases of walking, talking, normal children who wound up with profound mental disorders after vaccines. I'm not arguing vaccines are a bad idea. I think they're a good thing. But I think the parents should have some input. The state doesn't own your children. Parents own the children, and it is an issue of freedom.
Dr. Carson, you have been reluctant to criticize the senator. You say he's a reasonable person, but let me put this differently. Is that a reasonable statement?
Well, you know, what we really have to look at is the fact that we've learned a lot about immunology and the science behind vaccinations. And we've made tremendous progress in eliminating some devastating diseases over the decades. What happened a few years ago is that information was disseminated inappropriately, anecdotal in nature, about terrible side effects from vaccinations. And all of that has been carefully investigated and debunked. The problem is we have not disseminated the information widely to people. So there's still people who believe that there's legitimate concern. There is not. And we always look at benefit to risk ratio. You look at the benefit to risk ratio for vaccinations, way in favor of getting them. Is there an occasional problem, an occasional allergic reaction? Of course there is. But you have to look at the overall good. It's sort of like with seat belts. You know, we mandate that seat belts have to be worn when you drive. You know, that's not optional. We know that it works. The same thing with texting while driving.
And even worse than seatbelts, there are these other people who, when you don't vaccinate your kids, who you put at risk. And the last clip I want to show on the whole measles topic, this is Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institute of Health talking over on CBS's Face the Nation about how we're not facing an epidemic, but we are facing these outbreaks, and how there are significant portions of the population who are at risk because they can't be vaccinated yet, over in this clip.
Are we on the verge of a major epidemic here?
Not a major epidemic in the sense of globally over the United States, because more than 90% of the people in the United States are vaccinated. What we're talking about are outbreaks among vulnerable people. And I think what people don't fully appreciate is that children, even normal children without any issues of health, from birth to 1 year old, are not vaccinated, because you don't vaccinate children until they're 12 months old. So when you have outbreaks, children, for example, in daycare centers like we saw in Chicago, become vulnerable if there's enough infection in the country to allow for these outbreaks that we saw in California and Disneyland. That's the threat.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's the important part to remember. That's sort of the factual part of this whole measles thing after looking at the political back and forth. But I wanted to show that to you and cover that topic like I did last week, and sort of the developing political split, and especially in the Republican Party, is kind of interesting. And speaking of the Republican Party, the last topic I want to cover with 4 quick clips is the presidential contenders in 2016 on the Republican side. First, I want to show, this is a clip from CNN's State of the Union. It's Dana Bash. This is talking to Senator Ted Cruz, where he shows how he's going to be sort of a wild card for the Republican Party, because there's this upcoming fight on whether they're going to shut down the government. It's just a couple weeks away, as Dana Bash points out. Well, she's going to have Jay Johnson on in just a minute to talk about the actual calendar, but this is actually not a softball question. You'll see in Dana Bash tries to do a follow-up where she contradicts Ted Cruz as to whether he's responsible for the possibility that the Department of Homeland Security is going to run out of money in just a couple weeks. And he says it's not his fault, but you'll see how she comes back and points out to him, well, it really is his fault. And I'll talk about that a little more if you watch that clip here.
International Security Conference going on. Senator, I want to bring it back home to the stalemate in Congress over Homeland Security funding. The government, again, that part of the government runs out of money in just a few weeks. Republicans are looking at you and wondering, what is your end game here? Because this is a strategy crafted by you, the idea of holding up funding for the Department of Homeland Security in order to try to stop the president and his executive order on immigration. So what is your end game?
Well, Dana, the premise of that question is not true, and it's frankly ridiculous. This is a strategy that came from Republican leadership. This is the Cromnibus strategy. If you'll recall, I fought tooth and nail against the Cromnibus in December, because I said in December this gives up our leverage and it puts us into effectively a box canyon. So I would say it's now up to leadership to lay out their strategy. I told them this was not a winning strategy, and they went down this road anyway, fighting tooth and nail. But let me make a broader point. What we saw last week was stunning irresponsibility from the Senate Democrats. The Senate Democrats 3 times filibustered funding for the Department of Homeland Security. We have a bill on the floor to fund DHS, and
right.
3 times the Democrats stood together, filibustered, and said, we will not allow the Senate to take up this bill.
Senator,
at a time of growing national security threats across the world, that's irresponsible.
Hey, Senator, with respect, it's not a ridiculous premise, because what you wanted to do was hold up the entire government funding back in December, and the Cromnibus, we won't get too much in the weeds here, was a compromise to try to work around that. So that's, I think, the reality of what's going on here. On your point about the Democrats, yes, they are holding up the bill. They're not allowing debate. But isn't the reality that if there were a debate, this bill still wouldn't pass? And again, when I say this bill, it's funding the Department of Homeland Security, but also stopping the president from his executive action on immigration. The votes aren't there to pass that, right?
Well, Dana, number one, we need to fund the Department of Homeland Security. The Democrats need to stop holding national security hostage for partisan political objectives. What they're doing is wrong and irresponsible. Number two, when it comes to amnesty, the president's executive amnesty is wrong, it's illegal, and it's unconstitutional. And you say it would necessarily get support in the Senate. Well, you know, it's interesting. We don't know that. 7 Democrats had publicly criticized it on the campaign trail. They told their constituents they didn't support the president ignoring federal law, ignoring the Constitution, and unilaterally and illegally granting amnesty to 4 to 5 million people here illegally. I think we need to tee it up and give those Senate Democrats an opportunity to go on record to demonstrate
Senator, are you talking
whether they were
to those
telling
Senate
the truth
Democrats?
when they were talking to the voters back home. Or...
I don't know who buys that I know you are, but what am I type argument from Senator Ted Cruz. But he basically accused the Democrats of holding the Department of Homeland Security hostage for political purposes, when that's exactly what he's doing. And He accused the leadership of having engineered this whole thing, and he was against holding the holding the Obama administration hostage. I mean, it's like everything he does, he ends up accusing someone else of doing. It's kind of crazy in a way, but I also want to show a quick clip of having shown that whole thing about the coming split in the Republican Party on whether to shut down the government over the Obama administration's executive action on immigration. Here's Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson talking about how he's going to be able to say that the Republicans are going to lose a lot of going to get a lot of negative PR if you believe what Jay Johnson says over in this clip.
And the fight that's going on right now that could potentially shut down your department, or at least keep funding out of your department. I also want you to look at the calendar to sort of people understand how close we are to the deadline for that happening. It's February 27th. Here we are, just a little bit more than 2 weeks away, and we should note that, by the way, Congress is out of town. They're not working for one of those weeks, so it makes it incredibly difficult. Tell us where things stand right now. It is a standoff over the idea that Republicans are trying to push funding this bill along with making sure that the president's executive order on immigration doesn't happen.
Dana, I am on Capitol Hill now virtually every working day talking to Democrats and Republicans about the importance of a fully funded Department of Homeland Security in these times in particular. We're on a continuing resolution right now, which, as you point out, expires on February 27, which is less than 20 days at this point. And as long as we're on a continuing resolution, that in and of itself creates uncertainty about how we go about our Homeland Security missions. And if we go into government shutdown, for example, that means furloughing employees, furloughing Homeland Security officials. As Craig Fugate, the administrator of FEMA, pointed out the other day, if we go into government shutdown, he's got to furlough something like 80% of his FEMA workforce. And so I'm on the Hill every day stressing the importance of a fully funded Department of Homeland Security, separate and apart from riders to try to defund our efforts to reform the immigration system.
And are you
if people in Congress want to have that debate about immigration reform, let's have that debate. But don't tie that to funding public safety and Homeland Security for the American people. We need a fully funded department right now.
Actually.
So when you compare what Senator Ted Cruz said there with what Secretary Jay Johnson said, I think that the Obama administration is definitely going to win that argument. I think it's stupid for the Republicans to hold the Department of Homeland Security hostage. And as I've talked about on previous shows, they can't even really defund the whole immigration executive order because it's self-funded by all these fees, and you can't really defund someone not deporting someone. It's all very difficult. But I want to show a couple more quick clips on the whole Republican field for the presidential campaign for 2016. First, this is one more Ted Cruz clip where over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos gave Ted Cruz every opportunity in the world to come out really strongly against Jeb Bush, and instead he was pretty soft. I mean, he mentioned Jeb Bush's big vulnerable areas of Common Core educational standards and, of course, being too pro-immigrant, but he was still pretty nice to Jeb Bush over in this clip.
You've also been making the case to donors and activists that the GOP can't go with the establishment candidate this time around. You say Republicans lose when they run to the mushy middle, you said. Now, I know you like and respect Jeb Bush, but you've also suggested he's part of that mushy middle. What puts him there?
Oh, look, Jeb Bush is a good man. He's a good governor. I respect him. If he chooses to run, it certainly looks like he's going to. He's going to have to make the case to Republican primary voters concerning his record, concerning certainly his support for Common Core, concerning his policies on immigration. And I think we'll have a debate on that. But at the end of the day, I think Republicans are looking for a leader. And I'll tell you, George, what I would urge every Republican thinking about running to do, and this is true of senators, of governors, stand up and lead. I'd be thrilled if 6 months from now we have a half dozen Republicans standing and leading and making the case there is a better way. We can get back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that built this country and made this country a shining city on a hill.
Ooh, shining city on a hill. It's like a Ronald Reagan reference. That means he's definitely running, right? Or he sounded very much like he was running throughout that interview. He was interviewed, like I said, on both CNN State of the Union, on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. There are links to both shows down in the video description if you want to see those whole interviews. And then the last clip I want to show you, like I said, this is quite the softball question from Chris Wallace over on Fox News Sunday, talking to Dr. Ben Carson, talking about how he's doing so well in the polls, and he even admits at the beginning of this question that he and Dr. Ben Carson are friends, and then, believe it or not, the question, this is a slight paraphrase, but the question that Chris Wallace asked Dr. Ben Carson in this final clip of the night is actually, believe it or not, very close to, why is it that the voters like you so much? Over in this clip.
Politics with you. You say that some people have been brainwashed, that they think that only politicians can run for office. And I wonder, when you said that, whether you were thinking about me, because, as you know, I have raised with you, we're friends, the questions about your prospects in running for president. And I got to say, you are proving me wrong. We are going to put up two recent polls, the latest Fox News national poll. You're in fourth place behind Bush and Huckabee and Paul, but ahead of a whole lot of other people. Then let's look at Iowa, where you're in fourth place, but you're running ahead of Jeb Bush and a bunch of senators and governors. So, and I say this as a bit of a mea culpa, Dr. Carson, why are you connecting with voters?
Well, I think people are beginning to understand that our country is in a great deal of trouble. And if we continue with politics as usual, be they Democrat or Republican politics as usual, we're going to continue to sink. And, you know, we're called the United States of America. And we need to be looking at things that work for all of us, not selecting out groups of people that we want to favor and groups of people that we want to demonize. And the things that I'm talking about are American things and things that work, things that are affected by common sense. You don't have to be a lifelong politician to have common sense. Sometimes I think the longer you're in there, the less common sense you have.
So
we just need...
So let me, excuse me, we just have limited time here, sir. So an exploratory committee in the next couple of weeks and a formal announcement by May?
I believe that sounds like a reasonable time frame. Absolutely.
So that's another guy who sounds like he's running for president, and I gotta love that softball question there, but wasn't it like I promised? He basically asked him, why is it that the voters like you so much? That seems like definitely the softball question of the night, but I'm way over time. I'm almost at an hour and 50 minutes, and I'm sorry it went so long, and I appreciate all of you who joined me live. I think there are almost 100 of you, and let me know what you think of all those clips down in the video or down in the comment section. Also, as I've announced in a couple previous shows, I have this upcoming video that should be released on Thursday or Friday, and there's more. There's a link down in the video description where you can see the 5 different sources I'm using to take the clips for this video: cops, justice system, racist, classist, or both. And that should be released Thursday or Friday. And my Patreon patrons should get a sneak peek of it at least 24 hours in advance. So if you want to join, I also have a link down in the video description. You can support my videos on Patreon, become a patron. You can pledge like $1 a month or $5 a month or whatever you want, just to keep this channel going through 2016. And I should be talking more about that in the upcoming week or so, but I will also continue doing this show for the foreseeable future. Join me every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time to give you the best clips I can pick out from the corporate media. I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out today, and I'll be seeing you every Sunday for the foreseeable future for LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup, and I guess I'll be seeing you around on the internet.